Thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. And if you want to support Future Hindsight in 2025, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/futurehindsight now. By the way, it's not too late to pick up your very own Future Hindsight desk calendar. It's a small reminder to be the spark all through the year. Grab one now at futurehindsight.com/shop. All right, let's get to the episode. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. In the aftermath of the LA fires and the inauguration of a climate change denier as president, it feels like climate action is out of reach. It's difficult to be hopeful, but the history of the public interest movement in the 60s and 70s can be a source of inspiration for us going forward. This movement was a formidable force in influencing public policy that benefits all of us, from traffic safety to the Clean Water Act. To unpack what history can teach us about what's possible going forward, we're joined by Paul Sabin. He's the Randolph W. Townsend Jr. Professor of History and Professor of American Studies at Yale University. He teaches U.S. environmental history, energy politics, and political, legal, and economic history. He previously served as the founding executive director of the nonprofit Environmental Leadership Program and is the author of Public Citizens: The Attack on Big Government and the Remaking of American Liberalism. This book examines the evolution and impact of the public interest and environmental movements in the United States since the 1960s. Welcome, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat.
So you are an expert on the public interest movement, and more specifically on the movements in the environmental space. And I thought we should start with the basics. There are many different notions of what public interest means, and it would be really helpful to make sure we're all on the same page for this conversation. How do you define public interest?
Well, I think the public interest is something that has changed in its definition over time, and maybe make the most sense to talk about how it was contested in the period of time that I write about, which is really coming out of the New Deal in the 1930s. There was a sense that the public interest was something that was curated and guarded by the federal government, by government agencies, and that the agencies would act in the best interest of the people, and they would identify what the broad public interest was, and then they would pursue that using agency power. And then what I write about in Public Citizens is the emergence of a movement really starting in the 1950s, most strongly, and then building up into the creation of organizations in the late 1960s and early 1970s that started to locate the public interest outside of government and to see that government was causing problems. It was in too close alliance with corporations or big labor, and that it needed to be held true to some idea of a public interest that these citizen activists could identify and pursue.
Right. So give us an example that the public interest movement identified where government was really closer to corporate interest than the public interest, and where they didn't account for environmental externalities, for example, on the public.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of them. One example that I think really shows the turn in American history would be the Tennessee Valley Authority, which, when it comes out of the 1930s, it's really seen as the embodiment of this marvelous federal initiative to implement regional planning and bring flood control and electricity to the rural South. But by the 1960s and 1970s, TVA, as it's known, was involved with strip mining and other issues in the South, and it was seen as being now it was sort of a perpetrator of environmental harms. And so I think it's an interesting flip of the federal agencies starting from being the savior and then becoming the villain by the 1960s. And so then you start to have environmental organizations that are suing the Tennessee Valley Authority to try to block it from doing things. Another example would be famously, Ralph Nader is a major character in my book, and he gets very involved in auto safety. People don't usually think about auto safety as an environmental problem, but for Nader, auto safety was really about the environment that the human body was sort of positioned in the automobile, that the automobile itself was a kind of environment, and you were trying to create a safe environment around the body. But anyway, what he saw was that the big auto companies, including General Motors, were in close partnership with the auto safety regulators in the government, and they weren't really protecting the public, the consumers, and building safe vehicles.
Right.
And so that was, I guess, an example of a close sort of collaboration between corporations and government, not providing a safe automobile for the American consumer.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that example because you're talking about the human body. And I feel like what I read in your book was the environmental movement talked a lot about what it means to be a healthy human in this environment, right? Like if there's pollution, it's not healthy for humans. But I feel like when you talk about the environment today, people talk about the planet as opposed to the humans. And I wonder whether that also plays into the development we have today that people seem, I think, kind of removed from the effects of global warming. But I want to turn back to...
Well, can I jump in? I mean, I think that's a really wonderful point to understand the changes in environmental politics because, the environmental movement in the 1960s and 70s was really focused on clean air and clean water and toxics. And it was very much about human health at the center of it. And one of the challenges in our more recent time has been as we see problems like the ozone hole or greenhouse gases and climate change, they've tended to move into the realm of computer modeling about what's going to happen in the future. They become very abstract. And while they do have direct impacts on the human body, I mean, obviously look at the floods or the fires that have tremendous impacts on people. It's not as easy as looking out your window and seeing the smog or seeing, the scum on top of the lake from excessive, nutrients into the lake in Lake Erie when it was declared dead. So we have entered into a new phase where it can be hard for people to position themselves in relationship to these larger environmental challenges.
Well, let's talk about how the public interest movement fits in. How does it actually address the failures of the market and the government? And you talked a little bit about Ralph Nader already, but how did they do this work? How did they influence government to change their policies? Or in the process of writing policy, how did they have impact?
Yeah. Well, the public interest movement was a very legally focused movement and also focused significantly on using the press and public information to try to really pressure agencies. And so they focus their energy often on suing government agencies or participating in agency proceedings. So even if they were really angry at what a company was doing, they focused it on the permitting processes that allowed that company to take action. So if you go back and look at some of the environmental law organizations of the early 1970s and who they were suing, it's really just a list of government agencies, the Department of the Interior, the Atomic Energy Agency, the Department of Transportation. And so they were suing to try to stop new highways from being built, from dams from being constructed. They're trying to prevent the spraying of DDT and other pesticides, which are having a tremendous impact on the bald eagle and other animal populations. So it was a lot through lawsuits. The other thing that they did were investigations. So people often remember the name Nader's Raiders. It's a phrase that's often used to talk about Nader. And what those were basically student groups, students who came from college or professional school. They came down to Washington for the summer, and they would kind of rummage around in an agency trying to uncover corruption or bad decision-making problems that were there, and then they would publish a report on the agency. So it was not only litigation, it was also these kind of blockbuster reports that revealed that, for instance, the clean air regulation was broken and wasn't protecting the public interest in terms of delivering clean air to the people.
So as you're describing how they did this work, really when I think personally of public interest movements, I think that they really serve as a way for citizens to get engaged on an issue that is quite narrow. Like, for example, I'm not a lawyer, so, I'm not going to be a nature's raider, or I'm not going to go into an agency and try and figure out what they might be doing wrong or what kind of decisions that they're making that I disagree with. But if I were, for example, a dues-paying member of the Environmental Defense Fund, I do know that the EDF is going to be in the fight, or is in the fight, to represent my interests for a thriving planet. I'm curious, though, about whether this is actually a democratic, meaning little d democratic solution to address the public interest. Like, if I'm thinking about mitigating pollution as a public interest for all Americans, and I know that some Americans would disagree here, is the public interest movement the most powerful way to accomplish pro-environmental public policy? Or is there a stronger democracy solution?
That's a wonderful question, to kind of thinking about the issues of representation within the public interest movement and what the most effective paths to action are. I mean, I think even with the public interest organization, such as the Environmental Defense Fund or Natural Resource Defense Council or other litigating groups like that, I mean, I think that they don't see themselves as the groups that are taking the actions that are going to protect public health or protect the environment. What they see themselves as instead is catalysts who are going to prod the government agency to do the thing that it's supposed to do. And what that reminds us is that it's really the government that is ultimately responsible for protecting the public interest. Now, the question that comes up is whether the best source of direction for that government agency are the elected representatives in Congress or the agencies themselves as expert entities, or whether these outside groups like these public interest groups, whether they should be articulating, the vision that these agencies will then pursue. And I think there's been a lot of debate in recent years about the relative balance between sort of democratically elected officials and government agencies, and then these external community groups and who they may or may not ultimately represent.
Yeah, I think it's kind of tricky because we keep talking about elected representatives having to be accountable to the public, but so few people actually vote. And also, if they do vote, I think it's often the most motivated voters, which are often, in the extreme flank of their parties, or in this day and age, of course, especially when it comes to the environment, a lot of environmentally friendly Republicans, let's say, have been primaried from the right because they have been too pro-environment. And so I don't really know if the public can accomplish it, whether the elected representative can do anything, because it appears that many of them are unwilling, or if they are willing, then they get elected out, and then I don't know how strong the public interest movement is in this moment, because I think, the proof is in the pudding, so to speak.
Yeah,
Global warming has continued unabated.
Right. Well, I think there are two different aspects of that I'd highlight. One is just this interesting question about how representative the elected officials are. And I think you have to see the emergence of the public interest movement in the 1960s and 1970s as a declaration of failure on the part of the elected officials. And it's not a coincidence that it emerged in the middle of the Vietnam War, when there was a sense of the government lying to the American people, and also the civil rights movement, where there were particularly state governments that were not following the national law or were oppressing their own citizens. And so there's a sense of a need for this external force, and that you couldn't trust the elected officials because the elected officials may themselves be corrupt. So someone like Nader always called on Congress that Congress should be taking action, but there was a sense of despair or disappointment in what Congress was doing. And in the absence of Congress fulfilling its role, then these professional citizens would step in and try to remedy that and compensate for the absence of effective political leadership. Now, the current situation, though, is much different than it was in the 1960s and 70s, and I think that's important to note. One important distinction is the judiciary and how receptive it is to public interest litigation. When you go back to the first Trump administration, you had what people called the resistance. And a lot of that resistance was filing suits to block government efforts on the Muslim ban or immigration initiatives that they were pursuing, and rollbacks of environmental legislation. Scott Pruitt was at EPA in close consultation with oil companies and others trying to roll back environmental regulations. And so they filed a lot of lawsuits and tried to maneuver that through the judiciary. Now, the judiciary, has moved to the right significantly, and it's not as receptive. The judiciary in the 1960s and 70s, many of those were appointed by Democratic presence, or they were liberal in their leanings, and they were, really receptive to expanding the claims that they would recognize, whereas right now it's much more of a process of restricting claims by citizen groups.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Supreme Court in the wake of the Chevron deference being overturned by the Supreme Court. And, having read your book, I feel like, how do we get here? Like, how do you think about this turn of events that these public citizens essentially, I don't want to say that they failed, but their influence was so limited in the end?
Well, I think that the public citizens, accomplished a tremendous amount in a short period of time in the 1970s, but they were so successful that their methods were embraced by their opponents, who also claimed the mantle of the public interest, and they created conservative public interest organizations to sue over issues such as property rights, or more recently, lawsuits related to affirmative action. So these are other kinds of law firms that also claim to be representing the public interest, but they are finding a more receptive audience now with the Supreme Court that tends to be more aligned with their policy agenda. So I think one of the limitations of the public interest movement, of the liberal public interest movement in the 1970s, was they had these tremendous early successes, but they didn't realize how contingent it was on a receptive judiciary and also a sympathetic Democratic Congress. And they ended up sort of neglecting politics and trying to build political power. And so we've seen the slide, in terms of political power. And I think there's been an effort more recently, in more recent years, to try to, re-engage with state and local government and try to build political power. But the appeal of a successful lawsuit is very tantalizing.
Yes.
You had these organizations in the 1970, they were maybe 5 people working out of their kitchen, and they filed the lawsuit, and they basically caused the Alaskan pipeline to get halted, for years. It was just a remarkable power of the law that's quite different from trying to get somebody elected.
Yeah. Well, also, I think once you're a Supreme Court justice, you really can legislate from the bench, as it turns out.
Exactly.
This is for sure a real thing. Well, I'm also, in the context of the Supreme Court and what we just discussed with electoral politics, I'm curious about stronger democracy solutions because, if I'm a member of EDF, let's say, that addresses one issue, the environment, it feels similar to, let's say, a billionaire spending money to address one issue that this billionaire cares about. So in the current environment, in the face of billionaire spending on their legislative priorities, what is a way for community participation and engagement to have impact?
Well, I think you raise an interesting point just about the membership in these organizations, and there have been questions about how representative they are and whose interests they're serving. I think that certainly a broad-based organization that has tens or hundreds of thousands of members is representing a larger constituency or group than one billionaire who's able to drop all that money just themselves. So they are representing a set of interests, but there's been a debate more recently about, as we've struggled to build things in the United States, whether it's renewable energy or transmission lines or housing or transit, and community forums become a place where people sometimes come to protest against those proposals. And it's led to an interesting debate about representation. Do the citizens who show up at the community forum, are they representing the public interest, or are they representing their narrow interest as homeowners or as people who live near a park or who, care about one thing but not the other, as opposed to a government agency that maybe has the ability to integrate a broad range of challenges related to development and think about the right path forward. So I think there's an interesting debate that's going on right now about just the modes of community participation that got created in the 1970s, where there was a real veneration of the community and of people who came to the hearing. But now we've come to realize that the people who come to the hearing aren't always all the people who have something at stake in the issue.
Yeah.
Homeowners may come to the hearing, but renters who don't yet live in the neighborhood, they may not be represented at the hearing. There's an interesting debate, I guess, around this issue that I think is quite fascinating.
Yeah. We'll be right back with Paul Sabin, so stay with us. Make sure you hear this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, 2025. Has it sunk in yet? I'm sure you might be thinking, how am I going to make this year different? How am I going to build something for myself? Maybe you want to be your own boss, or see if you can turn that business idea you've been kicking around into a reality, but you just don't know how to make it happen. Well, Shopify is how you're going to make it happen, and let me tell you how. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand open for business and get your first sale. And with the new year here, the best time to start your new business is right now. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates, no coding or design skills required. All you need to know how to do is drag and drop. Shopify's powerful social media tools let you connect all your channels and create shoppable posts that help you sell everywhere people scroll. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. How? Well, they help with the nook and cranny details like shipping, taxes, and payments, all from one single dashboard, allowing you to focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. But what happens if you don't act now? Will you regret it? What if someone beats you to the idea? Don't kick yourself when you hear this again next year. Make this year the year. With Shopify, your first sale is closer than you think. And remember, you're not alone. No matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. And that's what I love about Shopify. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/hopeful to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/hopeful. I also want to share about a podcast I think you'll enjoy called Reimagining Us.
Many Americans find themselves at an unprecedented moment. We feel isolated. Our world is marked by divisions, and we're not sure how to engage neighbors across differences.
We know our communities thrive when they are places of belonging for all. It's time to rebuild the we, a bigger sense of we than what we see around us today.
That's why we created Reimagining Us. I'm Nicole Argo, the founder and executive director at the Together Up Institute.
And I'm Scott Hutchison, the executive director of E Pluribus Unum. On Reimagining Us, we'll be talking to behavioral scientists, change makers, and educators to understand why we're divided, to hear true stories of people bridging divides and finding common ground.
Reimagining Us is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/reimaginingus and togetherup.org/reimaginingus.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Paul Sabin. Well, I don't know if this is the right time, but I feel like we should talk about the parallels between the transition from Carter to Reagan and now the transition from Biden to Trump. Because one of the things that Nader, for example, talked about at that time, about the Reagan time, that environmentalists would be invigorated. And we're hearing something like that again now. But honestly, I would say in my personal circles, we are feeling pretty much defeated and deflated. And like I mentioned earlier, the proof is in the pudding because global warming has continued unabated. The planet is warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. So as I'm thinking about the future, I personally believe that the time for incrementalism is behind us. And I think there was some expectation of like radical, root and brand fundamental change during the Biden administration, and that didn't happen. But in your mind, what should that have looked like? Because we're getting it now under the Trump administration, but probably not in the way that the public interest movement would have wanted it. And that also happened under Reagan, right?
That's right. Yeah, there's some real echoes from the Carter to Reagan transition to today. And I think it gets to the question of how liberals relate and citizen movement and public interest groups relate to power. And I think that they had trouble under Carter thinking about what their role was in the Carter administration, and many of the public interest groups were unsure about whether they were supposed to support the administration and help it succeed, or whether they were supposed to continue to be outside agitators suing the government and protesting it. So Nader, at the end of the Carter years, basically said, what could be the difference between Carter and Reagan? Had his sort of Tweedledee, Tweedledum kind of, these are the same. And then Reagan comes in and, actually it's really different, quite different objectives and approaches. But it was very clarifying for public interest organizations, the early Reagan years, because they really knew what their role was, which was just opposition. And so they sued and they investigated and they protested and they tried to stop the Reagan administration from doing many of the things. And Reagan administration helped that by being very provocative. People like James Watt saying outrageous things, and they had a government reform effort that seemed like it was going to wreck all these different agencies. And so that led to a lot of resistance that was in many ways successful. I think you really saw that in the first Trump administration, the resistance that I was referencing. There was a real outpouring of protest and litigation and resistance. I think what we're seeing now is slightly unprecedented and different in the sense that Trump's back. And so we thought that wasn't going to happen, many of us. And it's a little hard to immediately regain those modes of the first Trump administration, those first months and weeks of the first administration. I don't think that means that people are necessarily going to just continue to acquiesce, but I think there is a lot of stock taking going on right now and trying to figure out what are the best paths. The other important distinction right now just has to do with the Congress. The courts moved to the right. The Congress has moved to the right. It's a different landscape. Is quite grim from the Democrats' perspective.
Yeah, grim is a good word. But we are a hopeful podcast. I just want to add
good. Yeah, there are a lot of reasons. There are reasons for hope. There are reasons for hope.
I mean, I think Ralph Nader wasn't wrong to say that people will be invigorated in opposition.
I think that's right. And it's very clarifying. It's very clarifying. Clarifying, and it's mobilizing. And for people outside of government, I think in many ways it's easier when you have a clear opponent. You know what you're dealing with. You're not trying to balance both your issue agenda and your broader political ambitions in sort of a complicated balancing act where you might be wanting to support the Biden administration, but then also trying to push the Biden administration. And these things can kind of get mixed up and complicated and lead to internal contradictions and tensions. I think you see less of that in organizations today.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things that really struck me in your book was that the impetus for the public interest movement was to deliver better governance, more efficient, less paperwork, but also a government that has more bite to enforce environmental standards and regulation. It really wanted to stand up for everyday citizens with limited or no power. And while the movement, of course, was instrumental in passing legislation like the Clean Water Act, not a lot of environmental legislation has passed since. And reading your book, I would have thought that the power of the public interest movement would have endured or would have gotten more wins, and yet here we are. So how do you think about the evolution of the public interest movement?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I do when I teach about these issues in my classes, I talk about the years after Reagan as really, for the most part, being a stalemate in which conservatives and liberals have sort of fought over the 1970s legislation. But the liberals have been reluctant to open up those laws to reform because they're worried that they will get overturned in some way, but conservatives have been unable to muster enough power to actually overturn them or diminish them because people fundamentally still want clean air and clean water and good health in so many ways. So we've ended up in this kind of stalemate. And the other aspect of it has to do with many of the issues becoming a little bit more abstract. It's a lot easier to get stuck in different camps on these things that are like climate change as opposed to a specific incidence of pollution that can be seen. So I mean, there have been moments, there's the Clean Air Act amendments, in 1990. There's been the ozone successful. There have been moments of progress. We've had moments of legislative action, but a lot of other things that have happened through administrative initiation. And that includes actually under the Biden administration and the Obama administration trying to regulate greenhouse gases, trying to invest in renewable energy. So there have been a lot of efforts to try to make progress, but it hasn't been in the nature of a sweeping environmental bill.
Well, given the executive orders that have just come out of the White House, about the, quote, energy emergency that was declared really as cover to increase fossil fuel extraction and limit electric vehicles, what is the public interest movement going to do? Just sue the government again? Like, I kind of feel like, has that not run its course? Or is there something else that you think is possible in this moment?
Well, I mean, I think suing the government is a good thing to do in a lot of cases. And there are some things like the administration's executive order on birthright citizenship that seem to be just blatantly unconstitutional. And, the first Trump administration was notorious for trying to do administrative actions without following the rules. And many of those lawsuits were successful in blocking various of their actions. So I think legal action and trying to force adherence to administrative procedures and to the law is worth doing. But there has to be more than that. I think there needs to be action at the local and state level where, progressive political leaders have power to try to initiate action and to model what can be done. I think there should be efforts to try to see where within the Trump administration objectives there may be opportunities to accomplish positive things. They may be few and far between, but there may be some opportunities. There's a need to try to figure out how to improve various aspects of government operations and efficiency. And that was being debated under the Biden administration, things related to, for instance, the National Environmental Policy Act and permit reform and things like that. Now, the problem that occurred under Reagan and that has also occurred under Trump is that the reform effort was so hostile to the agencies themselves and to the mission of the law. It was very difficult to build any trust among liberals to want to enter into a partnership and enter into government reform efforts as any kind of bipartisan way. And I fear that will also be the case with the Trump administration. We all can acknowledge that there may be ways that we want to improve the way the government operates and make it more efficient or more effective. We don't need years-long delays on trying to do important public works projects that need to get done, like build a transmission line or build more housing or things like that. We can agree that we want to be more efficient with those things. But the problem is that the Trump administration, in its rhetoric and in its approach, is doing almost nothing to try to build alliances in any kind of bipartisan way around reform. I mean, Jimmy Carter accomplished more deregulation in many ways than Reagan did. And part of that was because Reagan was so hostile to the purpose of the regulators that it just met, full-throated resistance. And you'll see that here, too, most likely.
You said some really interesting things here about Carter being more successful and about reform and making government more streamlined. And sometimes I wonder, when you hear that government needs reform, is that really what we need? We need government reform? Because sometimes I think when you do that, you just open a can of worms, which is exactly what happened with the public interest movement, right? Because the public interest movement essentially attacked government for being not as efficient as it could be or not as responsive as it could be for the public interest. It opened the door to litigation from the right. And I kind of feel like maybe this is the wrong frame. I mean, I don't know what the right frame is, but
well, there are those who, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are those who think that we should just embrace government wholeheartedly with its flaws and just accept its inefficiencies and embrace, government power and not, have these alternative views and critiques of it. I tend to think that is not a viable strategy just because when you go back to the kinds of things that the government was doing in the 1950s and 1960s, you can see just how bad those things could be. An example would be atmospheric nuclear testing, such a disastrous concept and something that really needed to be fought against. Just the blanket spraying of pesticides across the land, the building of highways through urban neighborhoods. Government power can really serve the public good, but it also can do dangerous things. And so I think that was what the public interest insight, the movement's insight was. Now, the challenge is, how do you get government to do good things without hobbling it from being able to do anything? And that's a little bit of the dilemma in more recent years, where there's a sense that things that were supposed to improve government action, like the National Environmental Policy Act, the California Environmental Quality Act, they've been kind of blamed for making it difficult for government to do good stuff, build the things that we need.
Right. Yeah. Well, I feel like that leads me to a question on liberalism. As the Democratic Party and the left writ large is examining the electoral defeat in 2024, One urgent call that I've heard over and over is to remake liberalism. That, of course, has been a rallying cry for some time, right? In different forms. Post-Carter, for example. And we touched on this in the beginning of our conversation. Liberalism in the 1970s is not the same as liberalism today. So what are the ingredients that you think must be there in a new kind of liberalism? And maybe start about, how do you think about liberalism? What is that to you? Maybe we should start there first. What is liberalism?
These are big questions. These are big questions.
Or the way that we, how can I say? When you think about liberalism, when you see it reported in the news, when people use that word, what springs to mind?
I mean, I still believe in a liberalism that sees us as a collective society trying to improve the lives of the people within that society and to use the public institutions that we've created and the resources that we gather up through taxes or through the public domain, lands and waters and things like that, that we're trying to make people's lives better. And government is a tool to do that. And a representative government can try to help support people in their health, try to help develop opportunities for work, opportunities for housing, and that liberalism is an approach to government that sees a role for the government in trying to improve people's lives. And I think the challenge that we've fallen into more recently is how well liberals are selling that vision, to the American people.
And not just selling it, but also delivering it. I mean, I think a lot of people would say they have not delivered.
I think that's right. And, the issue of inflation was a major issue in the last election. And it's unfortunate that the Biden administration, I think, was well-meaning in trying to stimulate the economy and to lower unemployment and try to recover from COVID, and also had big ambitions for trying to rebuild American infrastructure and invest in addressing climate. But I think many people, were quite upset about inflation. And I think that was a major issue.
Yeah. Well, inflation, I had a whole discussion about inflation with my high school son. And we were talking about how on the macro level, Biden did really well, right? Inflation softened, right? We had a soft landing.
Better than any other country.
Better than any other country. But the realities are, if you're an everyday person, your rent went up and didn't go back down.
Right.
Inflation was there to stay. It did not have a soft landing in your actual life. But one of the questions that I've always wondered, and I don't know whether you can answer this question, but one of the questions I have is, why didn't the Biden administration raise the minimum wage, for example? I felt like there was some low-hanging fruit that they could deliver on, that they could, then boast about afterwards in delivering and then also selling it.
I can't answer that about the minimum wage because I don't remember exactly all the ins and outs of what happened with the minimum wage negotiations. I mean, I think that the Biden administration embraced an old school sort of industrial policy. It had the idea of bringing back jobs and manufacturing to the United States and also building infrastructure, and to do that through new areas of the economy, including clean energy and electric vehicles, and to save the future of American auto manufacturing by helping American auto companies catch up with Chinese development of many of these technologies. And I think that they thought that was going to bring more political benefits than it did. One of the areas when we talked earlier about does government need to be reformed and should we just be left alone to do its thing? I mean, I think that one of the reasons why Biden's policies were not more popular has to do with how the government operates and the limitations in what they were able to accomplish. So, for instance, they passed initiatives to bring rural broadband to many places where there is no broadband, and almost none of that was accomplished. They passed laws to bring electric vehicle charging stations to make them widespread. Only a very small number of those were built. So I think that a lot of promise was represented, and many things did happen, so I don't want to misrepresent that. A lot of money went out the door and a lot of factories opened and jobs were created. But I think that the government is not as effective as we would like it to be in accomplishing things, and that limited the political benefit from some of what the Biden administration did. And some of those benefits are really going to accrue to the next administration because there are going to be new developments that will happen as a result of those laws that were passed, but they didn't happen during the time of the administration itself.
Yeah, infrastructure takes time, right? Something like this will take 5 to 10 years before the legislation has delivered, so to speak.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us today into action?
Well, I don't know if it's a small spark, but I will, I guess, focus our attention in a particular direction, which is on state and local government. I think really has to be seen as a great opportunity of our time. And I think that one way to think about it is, how do citizens and, liberals, which I count myself as, make liberal cities and states so compelling in their operations and what they've accomplished for their citizens that they become a model for national action later. And I think that when you look at a place, like California, many ways so wonderful and attractive, but also just outrageously high housing prices, unable to build, new housing in many locales. People look at that and they say, this doesn't work. We need a different model. Now, we need a California and a New York and a Connecticut that stand as a model for the country. And I think that can be, if we wanted to spark at this time, I think that's a place really to put some serious attention.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to mention, we were talking about states, actually in some red states, like in Texas, which actually has a lot of wind and solar power, probably number one and number two. The private companies that do solar and wind, they have their own lobby now. And so I wonder what this will look like under the Trump administration that has been prioritizing fossil fuels. But actually, some of their constituents in red states are going to be renewable energy.
I think that's right. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, a very large percentage of the money that has been spent by the Inflation Reduction Act has gone to Republican-leaning states. There are big solar factories and battery factories, I think, as well in Georgia. A lot of wind and solar development in Texas and other places. And I keep waiting for this political constituency to emerge in these places and sort of stand up for itself. And let's hope that it does now, because these places have a lot of jobs and important manufacturing businesses that's on the line with these programs.
Right. I saw in the news that Trump has halted the funding of these Inflation Reduction Act projects. So basically has defunded the building of bridges and roads in some of these places that have already been greenlit and now are not going to have it. And so I wonder whether finally they will wake up and say, wait, we need to regroup and make sure that the access to the funding is not cut off.
Yeah, I mean, people want the benefits of that funding. And I think that's just another example where I think litigation may come into play, because it's not actually clear that the president has the authority to overrule Congress's budgetary allocations like that. That money has been passed and signed into law, and I'm not sure that he just with a stroke of his pen, he can overturn the law like that.
Yeah, well, that could be unconstitutional, sort of like saying
we'll find out.
With an executive order that birthright is no longer valid.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Well, if we were going to stick on the climate issue, I think that one place to be hopeful has to do with the changing economics and technology within the energy sector. And, I'm old enough to have grown up in, the 80s and 90s and to remember when solar and wind technologies really seemed like a fantasy and that they would only exist with government subsidies. And in more recent years, you've had these projections from the energy agencies where they project out what they think is going to be the future solar production or wind, or what the cost of those technologies will be. And year after year, it's just always cheaper, and there's more and more getting produced and always beating what was predicted. And that's really, truly remarkable. I mean, there have been days in England where coal was not being used at all. And so I think we can be very hopeful, and it's going to be interesting to see whether a new political administration put up against these economic and technological changes, which is going to win out, because there's a way in which this revolution has already happened, and it's not actually clear that the U.S. government is going to be able to stop it. And much of it is happening around the world, and not necessarily even in the United States is not even the most important place. I'm hopeful that this will be really an unstoppable force that will continue to develop.
Yeah, I'm hopeful about that too, because so many places all over the globe have made such great strides in becoming reliant on renewable energy, and it has really proved the point that it's possible.
I think that's right.
Thank you very much, Paul, for joining me on the podcast. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Hope carries us forward. Your podcast is a spark, so thank you.
Thank you. Paul Sabin is the Randolph W. Townsend Jr. Professor of History and Professor of American Studies at Yale University and teaches U.S. environmental history, energy politics, and political, legal, and economic history. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Get involved at the local and state level. Yup, we're telling you that again. And why? It's because we need to get out there and prove the concept that a liberal government truly delivers a higher quality of life and represents the public interest. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Barbara McQuaid. She's a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, co-host of the podcast #Sisters-in-Law, and a professor at the University of Michigan Law School. Her first book, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, is out now.
Democracy depends on truth. It depends on an informed electorate. Liz Cheney, who lost her House seat because of her role in the January 6th committee investigating the January 6th attack, talked about how we cannot abandon truth and remain a free country. So truth is so critically important.
That's next week on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app. This way, we'll be in your rotation every week. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zach Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,